The Tale of Benjamin Bunny by Beatrix Potter. One morning, a little rabbit sat on a bank. He pricked up his ears and listened to the trit-trot of a pony. A small cart was coming along the road. It was driven by Mr. McGregor, and beside him sat Mrs. McGregor in her best bonnet. As soon as they had passed, little Benjamin Bunny slid down into the road and set off with a hop, skip and a jump to call upon his family, who lived in the wood at the back of Mr. McGregor's garden. There's Benjamin Bunny. That wood was full of rabbit holes, and the neatest, sandiest hole of all lived Benjamin's aunt and his cousins, Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail and Peter. Old Mrs. Rabbit was a widow, and she earned her living by knitting rabbit wool mittens and muffets. She also sold herbs and rosemary tea and rabbit tobacco, which is what we call lavender. Little Benjamin Bunny did not very much want to see his aunt. He came around the back of a fir tree and nearly tumbled on top of his cousin Peter. Peter was sitting by himself. He looked poorly and he was dressed in a red cotton pocket handkerchief. "Peter," said little Benjamin in a whisper, "who has got your clothes?" Peter replied, "The scarecrow in Mr. McGregor's garden," and described how he had been chased about the garden and dropped his shoes and coat. Little Benjamin sat down beside his cousin and assured him that Mr. McGregor had gone out in the cart and that Mrs. McGregor had gone too, and they were certainly gone for the day because she was wearing her best bonnet. Well, Peter said he hoped it would rain on them. At this point, old Mrs. Rabbit's voice could be heard from inside the rabbit hole calling, "Cottontail, Cottontail, fetch some more chamomile." Peter said he thought he might feel better if they went for a walk. So they went away hand in hand, and they climbed up the wall at the bottom of the wood. From here, they peered down into Mr. McGregor's garden. Peter's coat and shoes were plainly to be seen upon the scarecrow, topped with an old hat of Mr. McGregor's. Little Benjamin said, "It spoils people's clothes to squeeze under a gate. The proper way to get into the garden is to climb down that pear tree." Peter fell down head first, but it was of no consequence, as the vegetable bed below was newly raked and quite soft. It had been sown with lettuces. The two rabbits left a great many odd little footmarks all over the bed, especially little Benjamin, who was wearing clogs. Little Benjamin said that the first thing to be done was to get back Peter's clothes, in order that they might be able to use the pocket handkerchief. They took them off the scarecrow. There had been rain during the night, and there was water in the shoes, and the coat had shrunk a little bit. Benjamin tried on the hat, but it was far too big for him. Look at the giant hat. Then Benjamin suggested that they should fill the pocket handkerchief with onions as a little present for his aunt. But Peter did not seem to be enjoying himself. He kept hearing noises. Who do you think he's thinking about? But Benjamin was perfectly at home and nibbled on a lettuce leaf. He said he was in the habit of coming to the garden with his father to get lettuces every Sunday for their dinner. The name of Benjamin's father was Old Benjamin Bunny, and the lettuces they ate were certainly very fine. Peter didn't eat anything. He said he wanted to go home. He was so scared he dropped half the onions all over the floor. Benjamin Bunny said that it was not possible to climb up the pear tree with all of the vegetables, so he led the way boldly towards the other end of the garden. They had to walk along little planks under a sunny brick wall. The mice sat on their doorsteps, cracking cherry stones. They winked at Peter and Benjamin Bunny as they went by. Again, Peter dropped the pocket handkerchief and the onions went everywhere. They got amongst the flower pots and frames and tubs. Peter heard noises worse than ever. His eyes were as big as lollipops. He was a step or two in front of his cousin when suddenly he stopped. And this is what those little rabbits saw around the corner. What have they seen? Little Benjamin took one look, and in less than half a minute, in no time, he hid himself and Peter and the onions under a large basket. The cat got up and stretched herself and came to sniff at the basket. Perhaps she liked the smell of onions. Anyway, she sat down on top of the basket. She sat there for 5 hours. I cannot draw a picture of Benjamin and Peter under the basket because it was quite dark, and because the smell of onions was so fearful, it made them both cry. The sun got round behind the wood and it was quite late in the afternoon, but still the cat sat on top of the basket. After a while, there was a pitter-patter, 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 and some bits of brick fell on top of the wall, on top of the basket from the wall above. The cat looked up and saw old Benjamin Bunny prancing along the top of the wall of the upper terrace. He was smoking a pipe of rabbit tobacco, and he had a little swish in his hand. He was looking for his son. Old Mr. Bunny had no opinion of cats whatsoever, so he took a tremendous jump off the top of the wall and landed on top of the cat. He cuffed it off the blanket, off the basket, and kicked it into the greenhouse, scratching off a handful of his fur. The cat was far too surprised to scratch back. When old Mr. Bunny had driven the cat into the greenhouse, he locked the door. Then he came back to the basket and took out his son Benjamin by his ears and whipped him with the swish. Then he took his nephew Peter out and whipped him too. Then he took out the handkerchief of onions and marched them out of the garden. When Mr. McGregor returned about half an hour later, several things he saw perplexed him. It looked as though some person had been walking all over the garden in a pair of clogs. Only the footmarks were ridiculously little. Also, he couldn't understand how the cat could have managed to shut herself up inside the greenhouse, locking the door from the outside. When Peter got home, his mother forgave him because she was so glad to see that he had finally found his shoes and coat. Cottontail and Peter folded up the pocket handkerchief, and old Mrs. Rabbit strung up the onions and hung them from the kitchen ceiling with bunches of herbs and rabbit tobacco. The end.